There are hundreds of Poleas, but there's really two that I'm sure you have heard of in the past, and that are kind of indicative of a couple of different extremes of powerful Poleas. They are Sparta, which develops on a peninsula called the Peloponnesus, and then Athens, which is on a peninsula just to the north of it, the Attic Peninsula. And if you look at the map on the previous slide, you can see where those two are. Let's spend a little time talking about both Sparta and then also how we know what we know about Sparta. If you learned anything about these folks in elementary, middle, high school, it was probably something related to warfare and what good soldiers they are. And in many ways, that's kind of true. But I also want to engage something that's kind of developed a lot in studies of ancient Greek culture in the past maybe 20 years or so. And that's the idea of a Spartan mirage. So it's a term that was first coined almost 100 years ago by a French historian. But it suggests that the version of Sparta that we have, or that we tend to embrace, and that gets passed on both in the ancient world and then to us eventually, portrays these folks as like hyper-militaristic and in many ways heroic, but also not artistic or social or active in trade. And they're kind of presented as like idealistic, disciplined, trained followers who don't have any interesting bones in their bodies. And in reality, we know that actually isn't true. So let's take a quick dive into what we know about these folks and then why we think we know them in a certain way. By about the time of the Greek Renaissance, they had conquered all of the people in one of the most fertile plains in Greece. It's a plain called Laconia, and it's in that Peloponnesus. And at some point, a guy who they say was named Lycurgus, we have no evidence that he existed, but Spartans believe him to be an important king of the past, would have lived probably somewhere around the 9th century BC if he was an actual person. Apparently created a set of writings that explained what Spartans should be like. And some of the things in his writing suggest that, for example, children were judged by elders when they were born as to whether they could provide something for society or not. Or boys left the comfort of home at age 7 and were organized into troops and played and were trained for military service until they were about 18, and then they went through 4 years of specific military training and lived in barracks together from 18 to 28, and only at age 30, after they had fought in wars and been soldiers, did they actually earn the right to be citizens. All that seems to be relatively true, but at the same time, most of the evidence we have from these folks, aside from those writings of Lycurgus, seem to come from outsiders, seem to come from Athenians who are often at war with these folks and see them as very different. And if we look a little bit closer, we can see, for example, that they had a government that was very egalitarian. They had 2 kings, but those kings were elected and they rotated through. They had a council of elders known as ephors who advised those kings. Everybody was seen as equal, and they called themselves that. Although they did have a massive slave population. The indigenous people of the plain that they conquered, they turned into a slave caste known as helots. But the advantage for the Spartans was those helots did all the agricultural work. They grew all the grains, which allowed all Spartans, all Spartan men at least, to serve in the military and to become politicians afterwards. Another thing worth noting about these folks is if I had to be a woman in ancient Greece, I'd probably choose to be one in Sparta because they had more rights there than in any other poleis. You can also see from some of the stuff I've included here that there were artists among the Spartans. And so maybe our image of these folks is very austere and simple and warlike. But in reality, they were pretty advanced in terms of ideas of equal rights. Later on, you might have heard of Plato when he writes his book, The Republic, about how an ideal polis should be operated. He doesn't model it after Athens. He focuses on Sparta. And these were folks that in many ways were artistic, were engaged, and aren't necessarily just the warriors we think of, although we are going to revisit those in a series of 2 wars.